The October rain drummed against the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Church, casting fractured rainbows across the sea of black clothing that filled every pew. Margaret Whitmore stood at the front of the church, her hands folded over a crumpled tissue, watching as the last of the mourners filed past her husband's mahogany casket. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her black dress, though well-tailored, had the understated elegance of someone who had never felt the need to prove her worth through appearance. At 62, Margaret carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had spent 38 years supporting her husband's medical practice from behind the scenes, managing every detail of their life so Richard could focus on his patients. I'm curious about something, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching this from today? Whether you're listening while driving through your hometown or sitting in your living room after a long day, I wonder if you've ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you completely. Because what happened to Margaret that day would shake the foundations of everything everyone thought they knew about the quiet doctor's wife. The funeral reception was held at the Whitmore family estate, a sprawling colonial home that Richard had inherited from his father. Margaret moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting condolences with gracious nods and soft thank yous, her voice barely above a whisper. The house buzzed with the low conversations of Richard's colleagues from the medical center, longtime patients who had become family friends, and neighbors who had known the couple since they had moved to Millbrook 30 years ago. Margaret had prepared all of Richard's favorite foods, working late into the night despite her exhaustion, because she knew he would have wanted his friends to feel welcomed even in death. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Richard's longtime partner at the medical practice, approached Margaret with tears in her eyes. She told Margaret how lost they all felt without Richard's steady presence, how his wisdom had guided so many of their toughest cases. Margaret listened and nodded, her own eyes moist as she remembered the countless evenings Richard had come home troubled by a difficult diagnosis, pacing their kitchen while she listened and offered quiet suggestions that he would later present as his own insights to his colleagues. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself standing alone by the large bay window that overlooked the garden she had spent decades cultivating. The roses she had planted in their first year of marriage were long past their bloom, their branches heavy with rain, and she felt a kinship with them in their dormant state. The house gradually emptied as guests paid their final respects and returned to their own lives, leaving Margaret to face the reality of her new solitude. It was then, as the last of the medical staff were gathering their coats, that Margaret noticed her. The woman stood apart from the remaining guests, her presence somehow both bold and calculated. She was perhaps 45, with platinum blonde hair styled in an expensive cut that framed sharp cheekbones and ice blue eyes. Her black dress was designer, certainly more than most people would spend on funeral attire, and she wore it with the confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed. Diamond earrings caught the lamplight as she surveyed the room, her gaze eventually settling on Margaret with an intensity that made the widow shift uncomfortably. The woman approached with purposeful strides, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with each step. When she reached Margaret, she extended a perfectly manicured hand and introduced herself as Vivian Sterling, claiming to be one of Richard's business associates from his consulting work. Margaret accepted the handshake, though she couldn't recall Richard ever mentioning anyone by that name, and his consulting work had always seemed like a small side project he pursued more for intellectual stimulation than financial gain. Vivian's voice was smooth and controlled as she expressed her condolences, but there was something in her tone that felt rehearsed, as though she had practiced these words. She mentioned how much Richard had meant to her, how their professional relationship had developed into something quite meaningful over the past several years. Margaret listened politely, though she found herself studying Vivian's face for clues about this relationship she had never heard about. As they spoke, Vivian's questions became increasingly personal. She asked about Richard's estate planning, whether he had left clear instructions about his various business ventures, and if Margaret was familiar with all of his financial obligations. The questions struck Margaret as oddly inappropriate for a funeral reception, but she attributed them to the awkwardness that death often brings out in people who don't know how to navigate grief. Vivian mentioned that she and Richard had been working on several important projects together, investments that required ongoing attention even after his passing. She suggested that they should meet soon to discuss how to handle these shared responsibilities, implying that Margaret might not be equipped to understand the complexities involved. There was a subtle condescension in her tone, a suggestion that the widow might be overwhelmed by matters beyond her simple understanding. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. She excused herself to check on the remaining guests, but she could feel Vivian's eyes following her as she moved through the room. When she returned, Vivian was examining the family photographs on the mantelpiece with an inappropriate familiarity, picking up frames and studying them as though she belonged there. The conversation that followed would remain burned in Margaret's memory. Vivian spoke of Richard with an intimacy that went far beyond professional courtesy, mentioning private jokes and shared experiences that made Margaret's stomach turn. She referenced trips that Richard had taken for his consulting work, trips that Margaret now realized had been far more personal than business-related. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure, her years of supporting Richard through difficult situations having taught her to process shock without showing it. Vivian seemed to take Margaret's stunned silence as confirmation of her helplessness. She pressed forward, explaining that Richard had made certain commitments that would need to be honored, financial arrangements that couldn't simply be ignored because of his unexpected death. Her tone became more aggressive as she spoke, the veneer of sympathy dropping away to reveal something much harder underneath. As the last guests departed, Vivian lingered, making it clear that this conversation was far from over. She handed Margaret an expensive business card and suggested they meet within the next few days to sort through what she called Richard's obligations. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Margaret's hands tremble slightly as she accepted the card. Standing alone in her empty house after Vivian finally left, Margaret walked slowly to Richard's study. She had always respected his privacy in this room, but now she found herself looking at his desk, his filing cabinets, and his computer with new eyes. The man she thought she had known for 4 decades suddenly felt like a stranger, and she realized that her quiet, supportive role in their marriage might have blinded her to truths she should have seen. But what Vivian Sterling didn't know, what no one in that room could have suspected, was that Margaret Whitmore's apparent helplessness was as carefully constructed as her perfect funeral reception. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would shatter more than just Vivian's expectations. 3 days after the funeral, Margaret was still moving through her house like a woman underwater, each room echoing with memories that now felt tainted by uncertainty. She had spent the previous evening in Richard's study, carefully going through his files with the methodical precision that had made her such an asset to his practice over the years. What she discovered among his papers had left her sitting in his leather chair until dawn, staring at financial statements and travel receipts that painted a picture of the man she had married that she barely recognized. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 in the morning, its chime cutting through the silence of the empty house like a blade. Margaret set down her coffee cup and walked to the front door, already knowing who she would find on the other side. Vivian Sterling stood on the doorstep, but this time there was no pretense of mourning or sympathy. She wore a crisp white blouse and tailored black slacks, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated the sharp angles of her face. Behind her stood a thin man in an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase that looked heavy with purpose. Vivian didn't wait for an invitation before stepping into the foyer, her heels clicking against the marble that Margaret had chosen when they renovated the entryway 15 years ago. She introduced her companion as Marcus Rothwell, her attorney, a man whose cold smile suggested he specialized in the kind of legal work that left people financially devastated. Margaret found herself backing toward the living room as the 2 uninvited guests made themselves comfortable, Vivian settling into Richard's favorite armchair as though she belonged there. The transformation in Vivian's demeanor was startling. Gone was the grieving business associate from the funeral reception, replaced by a woman who spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. She began by expressing her sympathy for Margaret's loss, but her tone carried an edge of impatience, as though grief was an inconvenience that needed to be set aside for more practical matters. Vivian opened a manila folder and spread several photographs across the coffee table that Margaret had inherited from her grandmother. The images showed Richard and Vivian together at restaurants, on what appeared to be vacation trips, and in intimate settings that made Margaret's stomach clench with recognition. One photograph showed them at a beachside resort that Richard had claimed was a medical conference in Miami, his arm around Vivian's waist as they smiled at the camera like any other couple in love. As Vivian narrated their relationship, she demonstrated an intimate knowledge of Margaret's own home that was deeply unsettling. She mentioned how Richard had described the kitchen renovation they had done 5 years ago, how he had complained about Margaret's insistence on keeping her grandmother's china in the formal dining room, and how he had found the bedroom wallpaper that Margaret had chosen to be hopelessly outdated. Each revelation felt like a small betrayal, evidence that Richard had shared the private details of their marriage with this woman who now sat in their living room demanding payment for services rendered. The legal documents that Marcus Rothwell produced were extensive and detailed, each page representing a different aspect of what Vivian claimed was Richard's financial obligation to her. There were hotel receipts from trips they had taken together, credit card statements showing expensive gifts Richard had purchased for her, and even what appeared to be a lease agreement for an apartment in the city where Vivian claimed Richard had promised her a place to live. The paper trail was comprehensive, suggesting a relationship that had been going on for at least 3 years. Vivian's demands were staggering in their scope and audacity. She wanted immediate payment of what she called Richard's debts to her, including compensation for the time she had invested in their relationship, reimbursement for career opportunities she had allegedly passed up to be available for him, and ongoing support payments that she claimed he had promised her in writing. The total amount she was requesting would have required Margaret to liquidate a significant portion of Richard's estate, including potentially selling the family home. Margaret sat in stunned silence as Vivian detailed her expectations, her voice growing more confident with each passing minute. She spoke of Richard as though he had been her property, describing their relationship with a casual cruelty that seemed designed to inflict maximum emotional damage on the grieving widow. She mentioned romantic dinners where Richard had complained about feeling trapped in his marriage, weekend getaways where he had talked about wanting to start a new life, and promises he had made about leaving Margaret once his practice was fully established. The cruelest revelations came when Vivian began describing Richard's private thoughts about his wife. According to her, Richard had found Margaret intellectually unstimulating, socially embarrassing, and physically unappealing. He had described her as a burden he had carried for too many years, someone who had contributed nothing meaningful to his success but demanded credit for his achievements. Vivian delivered these character assassinations with a smile that suggested she was enjoying Margaret's obvious pain. Marcus Rothwell supported every one of Vivian's claims with legal precedents and case law, speaking in the measured tones of someone who had perfected the art of intimidation through expertise. He explained that palimony suits were increasingly common, that emotional damages were recognized by courts, and that Margaret's refusal to honor Richard's obligations could result in a lengthy and expensive legal battle that would ultimately cost her far more than Vivian's current demands. Throughout this devastating presentation, Margaret appeared to grow smaller and more defeated with each revelation. She asked few questions, her voice barely audible when she did speak, and her hands shook as she handled the legal documents. To any observer, she looked like exactly what Vivian claimed she was, a simple housewife completely out of her depth when faced with complex financial and legal matters. But between the moments of apparent overwhelm, Margaret excused herself twice to make private phone calls from Richard's study. Each time she returned, she appeared more shaken than before, leading Vivian to assume that Margaret was calling family members or friends who were confirming her helplessness in this situation. What Vivian couldn't hear from the living room were the calm, professional conversations Margaret was having with individuals whose expertise would soon become very relevant to their current discussion. As the afternoon wore on, Vivian's tone became increasingly aggressive and threatening. She spoke of going to the media with her story, of filing lawsuits that would drag Richard's reputation through the mud posthumously, and of making sure that everyone in their social circle knew exactly what kind of man Margaret had been married to. She painted a picture of public humiliation and financial ruin that seemed designed to terrify the widow into immediate compliance. The final blow came when Vivian produced what she claimed was a handwritten letter from Richard, expressing his love for her and his intention to divorce Margaret as soon as his practice could survive the financial impact. The letter was written on Richard's personal stationery, in handwriting that looked authentic, and it contained intimate details about their relationship that only Richard could have known. Margaret read the letter with tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling so violently that she could barely hold the paper. Marcus Rothwell delivered the ultimatum with the precision of a man who had done this many times before. Margaret had 48 hours to agree to Vivian's terms and begin the process of liquidating assets to meet her financial obligations. If she refused, they would file a comprehensive lawsuit that would tie up Richard's estate in court for years while simultaneously destroying any remaining dignity the family name still possessed. The choice, he explained, was between private resolution and very public destruction. As they prepared to leave, Vivian walked through the house one final time, pointing out pieces of furniture and artwork that she claimed Richard had promised her. She spoke of the antique dining room table as though she already owned it, mentioned that Richard had always hated the landscape painting in the hallway, and suggested that Margaret would be much happier in a smaller place that better suited her limited means and social status. Standing in her doorway, watching Vivian and Marcus drive away in a luxury sedan that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, Margaret felt the weight of the last 3 days settling around her like a heavy coat. The house that had been her sanctuary for 30 years now felt foreign and hostile, filled with the echoes of betrayals she was only beginning to understand. But as she closed the door and walked back to Richard's study, Margaret's demeanor began to shift in ways that neither Vivian nor her attorney could have anticipated. Tomorrow would bring conversations that would change the trajectory of this entire situation, and the apparently helpless widow was about to reveal capabilities that would shock everyone involved. The next morning brought a clarity to Margaret's thoughts that surprised her with its sharpness. She sat in Richard's study before dawn, surrounded by 3 decades' worth of financial records, legal documents, and correspondence that painted a picture far more complex than Vivian Sterling could have imagined. The phone call she had made the previous afternoon had yielded exactly the responses she had expected, and now she was preparing for a kind of battle that her late husband's mistress had unwittingly declared. At 8 o'clock sharp, Margaret's doorbell rang with the punctuality of people who bill by the hour. She opened the door to find Jonathan Blackwood and Sarah Chun, partners at Blackwood, Chun and Associates, one of the most prestigious estate law firms in the state. Jonathan had been Margaret's classmate at Columbia Law School 40 years ago, before she had set aside her own legal career to support Richard's medical practice. Sarah was a specialist in palimony cases and fraudulent claims against estates, with a reputation for dismantling exactly the kind of demands that Vivian had presented. The transformation in Margaret's demeanor as she greeted her legal team was striking. Gone was the trembling, overwhelmed widow who had cowered before Vivian's aggressive demands. In her place stood a woman whose questions were precise, whose understanding of legal terminology was sophisticated, and whose analysis of the situation demonstrated a mind that had never stopped thinking like an attorney, despite decades away from active practice. Margaret spread Vivian's demands across the dining room table with the systematic precision of someone conducting a legal review. She had already identified 17 separate inconsistencies in the documentation, 3 instances where dates on receipts didn't match the claimed timeline of events, and multiple examples of expenses that appeared to have been inflated or fabricated entirely. Her notes were written in the shorthand she had learned in law school, filled with citations and cross-references that would have impressed any paralegal. As they worked through the evidence, Margaret shared details about her marriage that revealed Richard's character in ways that even she was still processing. She described how he had always been skilled at manipulation, presenting himself as whatever people wanted to see while pursuing his own agenda behind closed doors. During their early years together, she had attributed his secretiveness to professional discretion, his frequent absences to medical dedication, and his emotional distance to the stress of building a practice. Now she realized that these traits had been warning signs of a pattern that had ultimately led to Vivian Sterling. The flashback to their wedding day was particularly painful for Margaret to recount. She remembered standing at the altar, looking into Richard's eyes and believing she saw a partner who would value her intelligence and ambition. Richard had seemed genuinely supportive when she told him about her acceptance to Columbia Law. even encouraging when she had discussed her plans for a legal career that would complement his medical practice. It was only after their honeymoon that the subtle pressure had begun, suggestions that her legal studies might interfere with her ability to support his more demanding career, implications that one professional in the family was probably enough. By their first anniversary, Margaret had withdrawn from law school and taken on the full-time management of Richard's emerging practice. She had told herself it was a temporary sacrifice, that she would return to her legal education once his practice was established. But years had turned into decades, and her role had evolved into that of an invisible partner who handled every aspect of their business operations while Richard received all the credit for their success. The irony was not lost on Margaret that Richard had never realized how much legal knowledge she had retained and continued to develop through her work managing his practice. Every contract negotiation, every malpractice insurance review, every real estate transaction had been an opportunity for her to exercise legal skills that had only grown sharper with practical application. While Richard saw her as a helpful administrator, she had actually been functioning as his unlicensed legal counsel for 3 decades. Sarah Chun was particularly impressed by Margaret's understanding of estate law, noting that her questions about asset protection and inheritance rights demonstrated knowledge that rivaled many practicing attorneys. Margaret explained that managing Richard's practice had required her to become an expert in medical liability, corporate structures, and financial planning. She had continued her legal education informally, reading case law and staying current with legislative changes that could affect their business interests. The most damaging evidence against Vivian came from Richard's own files, documents that Margaret had discovered during her systematic review of his study. Hidden in a locked drawer that she had opened with a key found in his sock drawer, she had found correspondence that revealed Richard's true opinion of his relationship with Vivian. Far from the love affair that Vivian had described, the emails showed Richard discussing her in clinical, calculating terms, referring to her as an interesting distraction and a useful outlet for stress. More revealing were the financial records that showed Richard had never intended to leave Margaret or dissolve their practice partnership. The documents revealed that he had been using Vivian for emotional gratification while carefully protecting his assets from any legal claims she might eventually make. He had never put her name on any accounts, never made any formal promises in writing, and had specifically structured their financial arrangement to ensure that she could never claim any ownership of his estate. The most damning evidence was a letter Richard had written to his attorney just 2 months before his death, explicitly stating his intention to end his relationship with Vivian and asking for advice on how to do so without exposing himself to legal liability. The letter described Vivian as emotionally unstable and potentially vindictive, someone who might attempt to damage his reputation or make fraudulent claims against his estate if she felt rejected. Jonathan Blackwood reviewed Richard's correspondence with professional admiration, noting that the deceased doctor had created a nearly bulletproof legal barrier against exactly the kind of claims that Vivian was now making. Every gift had been documented as a personal gesture with no strings attached. Every trip had been paid for through accounts that clearly established Richard's sole ownership, and every promise had been made verbally with no witnesses or written confirmation. But the most shocking revelation came when Margaret produced the original copy of Richard's will, a document that she had helped him draft and revise just 6 months before his death. The will contained specific language excluding any claims from individuals engaged in extramarital relationships with him, language that Richard had insisted upon after consulting with Margaret about the best way to protect their estate from potential future complications. As the mourning progressed, it became clear that Vivian's confident demands were built on a foundation of wishful thinking and legal ignorance. Marcus Rothwell, her attorney, had clearly not conducted the due diligence that would have revealed the strength of Margaret's position and the weakness of Vivian's claims. The photographs and receipts that had seemed so damaging were actually evidence of Richard's careful documentation of a relationship he had always intended to be temporary and legally inconsequential. Margaret's transformation during this legal consultation was remarkable to witness. With each piece of evidence they reviewed, she became more confident and authoritative, her voice taking on the measured tones of someone accustomed to complex legal analysis. She discussed discovery procedures, asset protection strategies, and defamation counterclaims with the fluency of someone who had never really left the legal profession, merely applied her skills in a different context. The session was interrupted by another unannounced visit from Vivian, who arrived with a moving truck and several workers, apparently intending to remove property from the house based on her claimed ownership rights. Margaret watched from the window as Vivian directed the workers toward items she had identified during her previous visit, her confidence in her legal position apparently absolute. Margaret's response to this escalation was calm and calculated. She instructed Jonathan to document the attempted removal of property while she called the police to report theft in progress. Her conversation with the dispatcher was professional and precise, providing case numbers and legal references that demonstrated her familiarity with property law and criminal procedures. When the police arrived, they found Vivian arguing with officers about her rights while Margaret presented them with property deeds, insurance policies, and inheritance documents that clearly established her ownership of everything in the house. Vivian's claims that Richard had promised her various items carried no legal weight against Margaret's documentation, and the workers were ordered to return everything to the house, while Vivian was threatened with arrest if she attempted to remove any property without a court order. The confrontation on the front lawn was a preview of the legal battle to come, with Vivian screaming about injustice and conspiracy while Margaret stood calmly beside the police officers, her legal team flanking her like an honor guard. For the first time, doubt began to creep into Marcus Rothwell's expression as he realized that the helpless widow he had been preparing to intimidate was actually a formidable opponent with sophisticated legal representation. As Vivian and her team retreated in confusion and anger, Margaret felt a sense of control returning to her life for the first time since Richard's death. She was no longer the victim of circumstances beyond her understanding, but an active participant in a legal process that she was uniquely qualified to navigate. That evening, Margaret made a series of phone calls that would set the stage for a confrontation that would end this situation permanently. She scheduled a formal meeting for the following week, inviting Vivian and Marcus Rothwell to present their demands in a setting where all parties would have access to complete documentation and expert legal analysis. Her tone during these calls was professional and courteous, but there was an underlying confidence that suggested she was looking forward to the meeting with anticipation rather than dread. The quiet doctor's wife who had seemed so helpless just days before was preparing to demonstrate capabilities that would shock everyone who thought they understood her limitations. The conference room at Blackwood, Chun and Associates commanded an impressive view of the city skyline, its floor-to-ceiling windows and mahogany furnishings designed to intimidate opposing counsel and reassure clients. Vivian Sterling arrived 15 minutes early, clearly intending to establish psychological dominance through her choice of seating and positioning. She wore a navy blue power suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, her platinum hair styled in sharp waves that framed her face like a helmet of confidence. Marcus Rothwell arranged his files with theatrical precision, spreading documents across the polished table in a display meant to suggest overwhelming evidence and legal superiority. He had brought 2 additional attorneys from his firm, young associates whose primary function seemed to be carrying briefcases and looking intimidating. The 4-person legal team filled one side of the conference table, their expensive suits and calculated expressions projecting an image of inevitable victory. Vivian spent the waiting time rehearsing her opening statement, her voice carrying clearly across the room as she practiced the emotional appeals she planned to use. She spoke of love betrayed, promises broken, and a grieving woman being victimized by a vindictive widow who couldn't accept her husband's true feelings. Her performance was polished and convincing, the product of careful coaching and multiple rehearsals. When Margaret arrived, the contrast was immediate and striking. She entered the room flanked by Jonathan Blackwood and Sarah Chun, but also accompanied by 3 additional legal professionals whose presence suggested resources and expertise that neither Vivian nor Marcus had anticipated. David Kellerman was a forensic accountant whose specialty was exposing financial fraud in estate disputes. Rebecca Morrison was a private investigator whose background in financial crimes had made her invaluable in complex inheritance cases. Dr. Amanda Walsh was a handwriting expert whose testimony had been decisive in numerous cases involving questioned documents. Margaret herself had undergone a transformation that was remarkable to witness. Gone was any trace of the overwhelmed widow who had trembled before Vivian's demands just days earlier. She wore a charcoal gray suit that was both professional and authoritative, her silver hair styled in a way that emphasized her intelligent eyes and determined expression. Most striking was her demeanor, which radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades in legal environments and was entirely comfortable with complex negotiations. The meeting began with Marcus Rothwell's presentation of Vivian's claims, a performance that he had clearly expected to be decisive and overwhelming. He spread photographs across the table, produced receipts and travel documents, and presented what he claimed was compelling evidence of Richard's promises and financial obligations to his client. His tone was patronizing as he addressed Margaret directly, suggesting that she might not understand the legal complexities involved and encouraging her to accept a reasonable settlement rather than face expensive litigation. Margaret listened to the entire presentation without interruption, taking notes in a shorthand that suggested legal training and occasionally asking questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of estate law and contract principles. When Marcus finished his presentation, she thanked him politely and indicated that her team would now present their analysis of the situation. Jonathan Blackwood opened with a systematic demolition of the legal foundation underlying Vivian's claims. He noted that palimony cases required evidence of explicit agreements and mutual consideration, neither of which appeared in any of the documentation that Marcus had presented. The photographs and receipts proved the existence of a relationship, but provided no evidence of the kind of formal commitments that would create legal obligations for Richard's estate. Sarah Chen followed with an analysis of the timeline that exposed multiple inconsistencies in Vivian's account of events. Several of the trips that Vivian claimed to have taken with Richard had actually occurred during periods when medical conference attendance records placed him in different cities entirely. Credit card statements that Vivian had attributed to gifts from Richard were actually traced to her own accounts, suggesting that she had purchased items for herself and later claimed they were presents from her deceased lover. The most damaging revelations came when David Kellerman presented his forensic analysis of the financial documents that supported Vivian's claims. His investigation had revealed a pattern of expense manipulation and document fabrication that suggested Vivian had systematically inflated the value of Richard's support and created false evidence of promises that had never been made. Hotel receipts had been altered to show higher rates, restaurant bills had been modified to suggest more expensive meals, and jewelry purchases had been backdated to coincide with significant dates in their alleged relationship. Rebecca Morrison's private investigation had uncovered information about Vivian's background that cast serious doubt on her credibility and motivations. Far from being the successful businesswoman she claimed to be, Vivian had a history of pursuing relationships with wealthy men and attempting to leverage those relationships into financial settlements. She had filed similar claims against 2 previous partners, both cases resulting in court sanctions against her for making fraudulent demands. But the most shocking revelation came when Dr. Amanda Walsh presented her analysis of the handwritten letter that Vivian claimed Richard had written expressing his love and intention to divorce Margaret. The handwriting expert's examination had revealed that while portions of the letter were indeed in Richard's hand, key phrases and sentences had been added later using different ink and showing characteristics consistent with forgery. The letter that had seemed so devastating to Margaret just days earlier was actually a skillful manipulation of genuine correspondence that Vivian had altered to support her false claims. Margaret watched Vivian's confident facade crumble as each piece of evidence was presented. The woman who had strutted into the conference room expecting easy victory now sat rigidly in her chair, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment as the scope of her deception was exposed in methodical detail. Marcus Rothwell's expression had transformed from smugness to alarm as he realized that his client had not been entirely truthful about the strength of their case. When the evidence presentation concluded, Margaret spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. Her voice was calm and authoritative as she revealed details about her own background that stunned everyone in the room. She explained that she had graduated magna cum laude from Columbia Law School, had passed the bar examination in 3 states, and had spent 38 years applying her legal knowledge to the management of Richard's medical practice and their combined business interests. Margaret described how she had been the primary author of Richard's will, working with him to structure his estate in ways that would protect their assets from exactly the kind of fraudulent claims that Vivian was now making. She had insisted on specific language excluding any benefits for individuals engaged in extramarital relationships, language that Richard had readily agreed to because of his own concerns about potential complications from his personal indiscretions. The revelation that Margaret had legal training and had been actively involved in estate planning sent shockwaves through Vivian's legal team. Marcus Rothwell's questions became increasingly desperate as he realized that the woman he had dismissed as an ignorant housewife was actually more qualified to handle estate matters than he was. His condescending tone disappeared entirely as he began asking technical questions about asset protection strategies and inheritance law that Margaret answered with the fluency of someone who had spent decades in legal practice. Margaret then produced documentation that she had been gathering for months before Richard's death, evidence that painted a picture of her husband's relationship with Vivian that was far different from what the mistress had claimed. Richard's private correspondence revealed that he had grown tired of Vivian's increasing demands and emotional volatility, describing her as clingy and financially motivated in emails to his attorney and closest friends. Most damaging was a recorded telephone conversation between Richard and his lawyer, made just 3 weeks before his death, in which he explicitly discussed his intention to end his relationship with Vivian and asked for advice on how to do so without exposing himself to legal liability. The recording revealed Richard's true feelings about Vivian, describing her as an expensive mistake who had become increasingly demanding and threatening as their relationship progressed. Margaret explained that she had begun her own investigation into Richard's activities months before his death, not out of suspicion but out of concern for protecting their estate from potential complications. Her legal background had made her sensitive to the risks that extramarital relationships could pose to family assets, and she had quietly begun documenting everything that might be relevant to future legal challenges. The systematic destruction of Vivian's case continued as Margaret presented email exchanges, financial records, and witness statements that contradicted every major element of the mistress's claims. Vivian's story of a devoted relationship was exposed as a fantasy built on wishful thinking and deliberate deception. Richard had never promised to leave his wife, never indicated any intention to provide ongoing financial support, and had explicitly discussed his plans to end the relationship before his unexpected death. As the meeting progressed, Vivian became increasingly agitated and defensive, her carefully rehearsed composure dissolving as the scope of Margaret's preparation became clear. She began interrupting presentations, making wild accusations, and demanding explanations that only served to highlight the weakness of her position. Marcus Rothwell repeatedly tried to calm his client, but his own confidence had evaporated as he realized the magnitude of the legal disaster he was facing. The final blow came when Margaret produced a sealed envelope that she explained contained a codicil to Richard's will, executed just 6 weeks before his death and witnessed by 2 attorneys from Jonathan Blackwood's firm. The document explicitly addressed the possibility of claims from extramarital relationships, providing detailed instructions for how such claims should be evaluated and dismissed. Richard had been so concerned about potential complications from his personal life that he had created specific legal mechanisms to protect his estate from exactly the kind of demands that Vivian was making. Margaret's presentation of this final document was delivered with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades in legal practice. She explained each provision of the codicil, referenced relevant case law that supported its validity, and noted that Richard had insisted on language that would not only reject fraudulent claims, but would also provide grounds for pursuing damages against anyone who made such claims knowingly. As the scope of Margaret's legal preparation became fully apparent, the atmosphere in the conference room shifted dramatically. Vivian sat in stunned silence, her dreams of a financial windfall crumbling as the reality of her legal situation became clear. Marcus Rothwell was frantically taking notes, clearly realizing that his firm's reputation could be severely damaged if they continued to pursue a case that was so obviously without merit. The meeting ended with Margaret's calm announcement that she was prepared to file countersuits for attempted fraud, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, unless Vivian immediately withdrew all claims against Richard's estate and issued a public apology for her false accusations. Her tone was professional but implacable, the voice of someone who had the law entirely on her side and the expertise to use it devastatingly. The formal reading of Richard's will took place in the same conference room where Vivian's demands had been so thoroughly demolished just days earlier. This time, however, the atmosphere was charged with the electricity of impending justice as Margaret sat calmly beside her legal team, while Vivian and Marcus Rothwell occupied chairs that seemed to have moved farther from the table, as though the other attendees were unconsciously distancing themselves from the discredited duo. Judge Patricia Morris, who served as the estate's appointed executor, opened the sealed envelope containing Richard's final will and testament with the solemnity that such moments demanded. Her voice was clear and authoritative as she began reading the document aloud, each word falling into the silent room like stones into still water. The will began with standard provisions for Margaret's inheritance of the family home, medical practice, and primary assets, language that surprised no one who understood typical estate planning. But as Judge Morris continued reading, she reached the section that Richard and Margaret had crafted with surgical precision to address exactly the situation they now faced. The language was explicit and uncompromising, stating that any individual who had engaged in an extramarital relationship with the deceased forfeited all claims to estate assets, gifts, or support arrangements. The provision went further, establishing that any attempt to make such claims would be considered fraud against the estate and grounds for criminal prosecution. Vivian's face drained of color as the implications of this language became clear. The will she had assumed would provide her with financial security was actually her legal death warrant, written by the very man whose love and commitment she had claimed to possess. Marcus Rothwell frantically scribbled notes, clearly calculating the malpractice liability his firm now faced for pursuing claims that were explicitly voided by estate documents he should have reviewed before taking the case. Margaret then produced the audio recording that would destroy any remaining hope Vivian might have harbored. The digital device sat in the center of the conference table like a small black judge as Richard's voice filled the room, speaking to his attorney just 3 weeks before his death. His words were devastating in their clarity and casual cruelty, describing Vivian as an expensive distraction who had outlived her usefulness and become an increasingly demanding problem. On the recording, Richard discussed Vivian with the detached clinical tone he might have used to describe a challenging patient. He mentioned her financial desperation, her emotional instability, and her growing tendency to interpret professional courtesy as romantic commitment. Most damaging was his explicit statement that he had never made any promises of ongoing support and had been careful to structure their relationship to avoid any legal complications should he decide to end it. The recording revealed Richard's sophisticated understanding of palimony law and his deliberate efforts to protect himself from exactly the kind of claims that Vivian was now making. He had consulted extensively with attorneys, documented every transaction, and maintained careful records specifically to ensure that his extramarital activities could not compromise his estate planning or his marriage to Margaret. Dr. Amanda Walsh presented additional evidence that had emerged from her expanded investigation into the questioned documents. Her analysis had revealed that Vivian had forged not just portions of Richard's alleged love letter, but had also created false email exchanges, backdated text messages, and fabricated receipts to support her fraudulent claims. The scope of the deception was staggering, representing months of careful preparation for what Vivian had clearly intended to be a lucrative legal assault on Richard's estate. David Kellerman followed with a forensic accounting analysis that exposed the full extent of Vivian's financial manipulation. His investigation had revealed that she had systematically inflated expenses, created false documentation of gifts, and even established credit accounts in Richard's name without his knowledge. The pattern of fraud extended far beyond simple exaggeration into criminal territory, with evidence of identity theft, credit fraud, and document forgery that could result in federal charges. The most shocking revelation came when Rebecca Morrison presented evidence of Vivian's previous attempts to defraud other wealthy men through similar schemes. Her investigation had uncovered a pattern of behavior spanning nearly a decade, during which Vivian had targeted successful professionals and attempted to leverage brief relationships into substantial financial settlements. 2 previous cases had resulted in restraining orders against her, and one had led to criminal charges that were dropped only when she agreed to make full restitution to her victim. Marcus Rothwell's attempts to salvage his client's position became increasingly desperate as each piece of evidence was presented. He suggested that the audio recording might have been taken out of context, that the forensic evidence could be challenged by other experts, and that Vivian's previous legal troubles were irrelevant to the current case. But his arguments carried no conviction, and his obvious discomfort suggested that he was already calculating how quickly he could withdraw from representation. The abandonment began almost immediately. Marcus excused himself from the room for a lengthy phone conversation with his firm's partners, returning with the pale complexion of someone who had just learned about significant financial and reputational consequences. He announced that his firm was withdrawing from representation due to what he termed irreconcilable differences with the client regarding case strategy and legal ethics. The 2 associate attorneys who had accompanied Marcus began packing their materials with obvious relief, their expressions suggesting that they had recognized the legal disaster unfolding before them and were eager to distance themselves from the inevitable consequences. Within minutes, Vivian found herself alone at the conference table, abandoned by the legal team that had encouraged her demands and left to face the mounting evidence of her fraudulent behavior without professional representation. Judge Morris reviewed the complete evidentiary package with the thoroughness that her position demanded. She examined the forged documents, listened to portions of the audio recording again, and studied the forensic accounting analysis with the attention to detail that had made her one of the most respected jurists in the state. Her conclusion was swift and uncompromising, ruling that Vivian's claims were not only without merit but constituted attempted fraud against the estate. Margaret's countersuit was filed immediately, seeking damages for emotional distress, defamation of Richard's character, attempted theft of estate assets, and the costs associated with defending against fraudulent claims. The legal documents were comprehensive and devastating, requesting not only monetary damages but also a permanent restraining order that would prevent Vivian from making any future claims against the estate or attempting to contact Margaret in any capacity. The evidence package was simultaneously forwarded to the district attorney's office with a formal complaint requesting criminal prosecution for fraud, forgery, identity theft, and attempted extortion. The documentation was so comprehensive and the evidence so overwhelming that prosecutors would later describe it as one of the most complete fraud cases they had ever received from a civil proceeding. As the meeting concluded, Vivian sat in stunned silence, the reality of her situation finally penetrating the delusions that had sustained her confidence throughout this disastrous proceeding. The financial windfall she had expected had transformed into the prospect of criminal prosecution, civil liability, and complete social disgrace. Her dreams of easy wealth had become a nightmare of legal consequences that would follow her for years to come. Margaret's transformation was now complete, her evolution from apparently helpless widow to formidable legal adversary having reached its triumphant conclusion. She had not only protected Richard's estate from fraudulent claims, but had also ensured that Vivian would face serious consequences for her attempted deception. The quiet doctor's wife had revealed herself to be a force of legal retribution that neither Vivian nor her attorneys had been prepared to face. 6 months after the destruction of Vivian Sterling's fraudulent claims, Margaret Whitmore stood in her law office for the first time in 38 years, reviewing the shingle that read Margaret Whitmore, attorney at law, estate planning, and probate. The decision to return to active legal practice had surprised everyone who knew her, but for Margaret it felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that she had set aside for too long in service of someone else's dreams. The transformation of the woman who had once cowered before Vivian's demands was remarkable to witness. Margaret had lost 20 pounds, updated her wardrobe to reflect her professional status, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had rediscovered her own capabilities. Her gray hair was now styled in a sophisticated cut that emphasized her intelligent eyes, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had emerged victorious from a battle that had tested every aspect of her character. The legal proceedings against Vivian had concluded with results that exceeded even Margaret's expectations. The district attorney's office had prosecuted the fraud case aggressively, resulting in Vivian's conviction on multiple felony counts including forgery, identity theft, and attempted extortion. The judge had sentenced her to 18 months in minimum security prison, followed by 3 years of probation and full restitution to Margaret for all legal costs and damages. The civil lawsuit had been equally devastating for Vivian's finances and reputation. The jury had awarded Margaret substantial damages for emotional distress and defamation, while the judge had issued a permanent restraining order that prevented Vivian from making any future contact or claims. The financial judgment would follow Vivian for the rest of her life, ensuring that any future earnings would be garnished to pay for her fraudulent behavior. Marcus Rothwell and his law firm had faced their own consequences for their role in pursuing claims that proper due diligence would have revealed as fraudulent. The State Bar Association had launched an investigation into their practices, resulting in professional sanctions and a substantial malpractice settlement that Margaret had donated to a legal aid society that helped vulnerable women navigate estate disputes. The ripple effects of Vivian's exposure had spread throughout the social and professional circles where she had operated for years. Her previous victims had come forward with their own stories of manipulation and fraud, leading to additional criminal charges and civil lawsuits that would keep her in legal jeopardy for years to come. The network of enablers who had supported her schemes had quietly distanced themselves, leaving her completely isolated from the social connections that had made her predatory behavior possible. Margaret's own reputation had undergone a remarkable rehabilitation as the truth about her background and capabilities became known. The medical community that had seen her as merely Richard's supportive wife now recognized her as a formidable legal professional who had been the true architect of many of the business strategies that had made her husband's practice so successful. Colleagues who had dismissed her as a simple housewife now sought her expertise in estate planning and asset protection. The revelation of Margaret's legal background had also cast new light on her marriage to Richard, helping people understand the true dynamics of their relationship. Friends and colleagues began to realize that Richard's professional success had been built on Margaret's invisible contributions, her legal knowledge and business acumen providing the foundation that had allowed him to focus on medical practice while she handled the complex financial and regulatory challenges of running a healthcare business. Margaret's decision to resume active legal practice had been motivated partly by a desire to help other women who found themselves in situations similar to what she had faced. Her first cases had involved representing widows and divorced women who were dealing with fraudulent claims against their estates, and her success rate had quickly established her as one of the most effective estate attorneys in the region. The irony of her career resurrection was not lost on Margaret, who often reflected on how Richard's betrayal had ultimately led to her rediscovering strengths and capabilities that she had forgotten she possessed. The pain of learning about his affairs had been devastating, but the process of protecting her estate had reminded her of the satisfaction that came from practicing law and helping people navigate complex legal challenges. Vivian's public humiliation had been complete and lasting. The story of her fraudulent claims and criminal conviction had spread throughout the affluent social circles where she had operated, ensuring that she would never again be able to target vulnerable men through romantic manipulation. Her reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that even after completing her prison sentence, she would face years of social exile and financial difficulty. The contrast between the two women's post-trial lives was striking. Margaret had emerged stronger and more successful than ever, her legal practice thriving as clients sought out an attorney who had proven her ability to protect estates from sophisticated fraud. Vivian had lost everything she had worked to build over the previous decade, her schemes exposed, and her credibility permanently destroyed. Margaret often thought about the lessons that emerged from this entire experience, particularly the danger of underestimating people based on their apparent roles or social positions. Richard had made the fatal error of assuming that his quiet, supportive wife lacked the knowledge and determination to protect herself from his deceptions. Vivian had compounded that mistake by believing that a grieving widow would be helpless against aggressive legal tactics and emotional manipulation. The case had also highlighted the importance of careful estate planning and the value of working with knowledgeable legal professionals who could anticipate and prevent the kind of complications that Richard's personal life had created. Margaret's new practice focused heavily on helping clients structure their estates to protect against fraudulent claims while ensuring that legitimate beneficiaries received appropriate support. As she prepared to close her office for the day, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that terrible afternoon when Vivian Sterling had first appeared at her door. The frightened, overwhelmed widow who had trembled before false legal threats had been replaced by a confident professional who was helping other people navigate similar challenges with knowledge and strength. Before I wrap up this incredible story of justice and transformation, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone completely underestimated your abilities or tried to take advantage of what they saw as your weakness? How did it feel when you were able to prove them wrong? Share your experiences in the comments below, because sometimes the most powerful victories come from showing the world capabilities that others never knew we possessed. Margaret's journey from grieving widow to victorious attorney reminds us that our greatest strengths are often hidden until circumstances demand that we reveal them. The transformation was complete. Margaret Whitmore had not only survived her husband's betrayal and protected his estate from fraudulent claims, but had also reclaimed her identity as a skilled legal professional capable of helping others avoid similar victimization. The woman who had once seemed so vulnerable had proven that appearances can be deceiving, and that underestimating a grieving widow can be a very expensive mistake.